Remember, I talked about the war in Chechnya. Well, that started as a low-level conflict in Chechnya, not a full-scale war. You've got some separatists, and they're making some noise, and the Russians are trying to keep a lid on it. But then these separatists leave Chechnya and invade a different region of Russia called Dagestan. Well, Russia responds and starts bombing them, and this is August 1999. Boris Yeltsin is still president, but he's pretty old and frail, so he delegates responsibility for the conflict to his prime minister, a guy by the name of Sergei Stepashin. At this point, Putin is still head of the FSB. So President Yeltsin says the actions undertaken by his prime minister aren't good enough. He hasn't been aggressive enough in coming after the rebels, so he fires that prime minister and names Vladimir Putin as prime minister. And Putin is really aggressive in his tactics, and it doesn't take long before he has the rebels on the run out of Dagestan and back in Chechnya. Now, to Putin, it was paramount to totally destroy the rebels. He was afraid the country would come apart like Yugoslavia. He thought if they didn't put an immediate and emphatic end to all this, people would be emboldened by it and Russia would come apart piece by piece and eventually cease to exist. So he favored going into Chechnya and stamping out this rebellion at its source. But the public wasn't so sure. They didn't like the war at all. They didn't want to see it escalate. So Putin was hamstrung. But then he seemingly got a gift from the Chechen rebels. In the early morning of September 4th, 1999, there was an enormous explosion that leveled an apartment building in the Russian town of Bunaksk. Probably getting that wrong. In Dagestan. It killed 64 people and injured 133 others. 5 days later, on September 9th, there was a similar bombing in an apartment building in Moscow, which killed 94 people and injured 249. On September 13th, there was another bombing in Moscow, and this one killed 118. Then on September 16th, there was a bombing in Volgodonsk, which killed 18 people and injured 288. Now remember, these were Muslim separatists who were fighting in Dagestan and Chechnya, and these bombings are kind of, well, I mean, it's not unheard of for Islamic terrorists to bomb civilians, right? So we have our culprit, open and shut. It was the Chechens, and that's exactly what the Russian government is saying. This was carried out by Chechen Islamic terrorists. The public is in a full-blown panic, as you can imagine. They're also in a rage. They're really, really upset. Countries tend to rally around when they're being attacked. And so support for the war in Chechnya is actually increasing. 3 days later, after the bombing on Volgodonsk, on September 23rd, something very strange happens. In the early hours of the morning, a bus driver in a city called Ryazan, which is southeast of Moscow, noticed a white car parked outside his apartment building. There was a young woman standing outside the car, a man inside the car, and another man who had apparently been taking something inside the apartment building. And he was on edge because of the previous bombings, and so he called the local police. And when the police showed up and investigated, the car was gone, but they found a massive bomb in the basement of the apartment building. The apartment building was evacuated, the local bomb squad was called in, and they were able to defuse the bomb before it blew up, thankfully. Public officials commended the citizens of Ryazan on their vigilance. They had been on the lookout, and by so doing, they had stopped a terrorist attack. They had caught these people. The man who saw the car and the would-be terrorists was able to give a detailed description of what they looked like. And then good luck struck again when a local telephone operator overheard a caller telling someone, you should split up and do your best to get out of the city undetected. And that sounds pretty incriminating, right? That sounds like that's probably the bombers. So they think we have our terrorists. They're able to trace the call, and they show up to arrest them. They find 3 people. They match the description provided by the bus driver. But there's one problem. They aren't Chechen rebels. They aren't even Chechen. They're ethnic Russians. And furthermore, they are badge-carrying FSB agents. Once word of this gets out, the director of the FSB talks to some reporters and tells them, oh, actually, the whole thing was a training exercise to make sure everyone was prepared for bombings like this, and they passed, they did a great job, good job, everyone, nothing to see here. But no one seemed to know about this. Not the local mayor, not the governor, not the local police, not the bomb squad. In fact, the local bomb squad that had been called in to defuse the bomb undercut this whole story. They swore that they had tested the chemicals, and it truly was a live bomb. And not only that, but the chemical that they tested positive in this bomb was RDX, also known as hexogen, which is a chemical produced by the Russian military, and it's extremely difficult to acquire on the black market. So all in all, this government explanation of this was just a test, that's why it was carried out by FSB agents, doesn't seem to add up at all. And so you have to ask yourself, is it possible that Putin had been orchestrating these bombings in order to boost his popularity and give him cover for an all-out war in Chechnya? I don't think it's only possible, I think it's likely. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in conspiracy theories. I don't believe 9/11 was an inside job. I think there was only one shooter who killed JFK, all of that. But to me, the evidence seems to indicate that the Russian government was behind the bombings of late 1999. There are some people who suggest that, okay, maybe it was the FSB, but Putin himself wasn't directly involved in the planning. Maybe it was rogue elements within the FSB. That also seems pretty unlikely to me. The bombings didn't occur before Putin became prime minister, and no one benefited from it more than he did. I think in all likelihood, Putin bombed hundreds of Russians in order to legitimize military actions in Chechnya that he thought were necessary to preserve Russia. That is how ruthless Vladimir Putin is. If you want to achieve what others are not or have not been able to achieve, you either have to do things that others can't do by being extremely smart or talented, or you can do what others won't do by being ruthless and scrupulous. And Putin is an example of the latter. Nevertheless, this incident did not have serious repercussions for Putin. People didn't really want to believe that their government had been involved with something like this. Putin's former finance minister, Mikhail Kazyanov, summed it up pretty well. When asked if the Russian government was behind the attacks, he said, quote, "I don't know. I don't know, and I don't want to believe that it could be true." And that was the attitude basically everyone took. They didn't want to believe, so they didn't. Well, anyway, after this, as discussed previously, he rolls into Chechnya with the full force of the Russian military and wages an all-out war. And at first, it's popular. He rides this wave of popularity and wins election as president of Russia in March of 2000. Now, he's a complete political novice. He's just been elected for the first time to anything. He had never won an election. He hadn't won an election as dog catcher. He had always been appointed. He was never really the head boss. So from someone like that, you might expect a tepid, hesitant, modest agenda starting out. And you'd be wrong. His inauguration sets the tone. The previous inaugurations of the only other president, Boris Yeltsin, had been held in a hideous Soviet-era legislative building in the Kremlin. If you've ever seen Soviet architecture, it is uniformly very, very ugly. And Yeltsin had chosen this because the only alternative is to reach back and hold the inauguration in a royal palace from the pre-Soviet era. And that's a problem because you don't want to seem aristocratic or corrupt. It didn't seem democratic to hold your inauguration in a royal palace. But Putin doesn't care. He holds his inauguration in a beautiful palace built for Tsar Nicholas I in the Kremlin. And afterwards, for good measure, he has a giant military parade. And that was a risky move, but it's a good one. It turns out the Russian people don't care about all this history. Putin looks powerful, and they like that. And this is something Putin does well for his entire career. It's not just the rich trappings of power, the palaces and such, but he also goes out of his way to appear physically strong. You've probably seen some of the pictures. He's gone to nature reserves to play with tigers, and there was a staged photo op where he went diving in the Black Sea and discovered some ancient Greek urns, which obviously had been placed there before for him to discover. He's also had himself filmed doing judo, which he's pretty good at. And there's some great unintentional comedy out there too, and with all these pictures of him riding around on horses without his shirt on and the like. And something I think people take for granted is this very ancient, tribal, very basic desire we have to follow strong, powerful men. In the developed Western world, we laugh when we see stuff like this. We think we're better than that. We laugh when we see Kim Jong-un claiming that he shot 34 under par in his first round ever playing golf. And yet, really, we're not much different. The presidential motorcade has 25 vehicles in it. Do you think those are all really necessary? I mean, they all have an official function, I'm sure, But really, a part of having a motorcade that big is projecting power, seeming powerful. Also, every president I can remember in the United States has had pieces written about them in which they show off and embellish their physical strength and prowess. George Bush made sure reporters knew how often he went mountain biking and how much he could bench press. Barack Obama also made sure to leak how much he could bench press, which was